First of all, I want to thank the Baldwin Institute for hosting this talk. Again, I want to reemphasize, this isn't really any type of debate. This lecture is meant to give us a perspective of what we're dealing with as a healthcare, medical community, science community, as American society, as a global community, with regard to vaccines. So I hope you will receive it as such. So the title that I have just for the lecture is a bit different than the poster. I just sort of said the Vaccination Debate, a report. And as you can see on the screen here, there are pictures of, photographs or cartoons from two different eras. The one on the left, which could actually have been written or drawn today, which I've seen more contemporary political cartoons like it. The one on the left was from 1930s America. And as you can see, there is a sort of a hodgepodge of symbology here. You have men who are all labeled as anti-vaccination. I don't know what the second term is. I think faddist or fascist maybe. I don't know. The third one is Mr. Careless, and the fourth one is anti-everything. And it's interesting that those terms are applied to people today who in any way question or sort of buck vaccinations as a type of healthcare, as a type of science, as a way of looking at yourself and your personal health. Those sorts of terms, anti-vaccination, anti-everything, Mr. Careless, people who don't care about society, those sorts of terms are appended or placed on top of people in the 21st century United States. Anyway, so this is from the 1930s. This was in the middle of, I think, the Great Depression. And the cliff that they're about to walk off of is called misinformation. Okay? And the sea that they're going to drop into once they walk off the cliff is called smallpox, which in the 1930s and into the 40s, smallpox was a really, really big issue in the United States. Now we move forward to the 21st century. We have a lot of sort of interesting things that have been happening over the last 5 to 10 years. In the last year or so, measles has been a big outbreak in the United States. It really came to sort of public consciousness when Bubba Crosby and other very important, very famous National Hockey League players contracted measles during the season. So that, in addition to the Ebola outbreak, as some people called it, made people really come into another sort of early 21st century conversation about who doesn't want vaccines, who challenges vaccines, who is pro-vaccine, and sort of what that means about sort of our state of society and politics and sort of science and healthcare today in the United States. So the cartoon on the right is actually from the last year or so, and it is a man talking to a patient, and the man talking to the patient has this suit on that's protecting him, and there's a tag that says FDA, and the cartoon starts, Ebola starts with flu-like symptoms, then fever and shaking, finally you bleed out and die. The patient on their bed says, there's a promising drug in America, why not try it? Then the FDA basically says, it might make you sick. Now, I found this cartoon very ironic because when I was working in pharmacy in Washington, D.C. about 3 years ago, 3 years ago, pharmacists who I worked with at a hospital in D.C. were actually also employed by the FDA. Well, some of the stories we shared were about everything we knew about healthcare. We would talk about family and what we did with our family, people we worked with. And some of the pharmacists actually that work for the FDA would tell me, people at the FDA, including physicians and pharmacists, they don't vaccinate their children. And I was like, really? That's interesting. And it really didn't dawn on me the significance of their statements until we came into this realm of vaccine debate, right? So, thinking back 2 or 3 years and hearing pharmacists and that worked with physicians and pharmacists, the FDA and scientists say, well, those people who helped sort of legislate and craft and legitimize vaccines won't give those very same vaccines to their children, and they won't take the vaccines themselves. So anyway, it provides us with the beginning of a very interesting conversation about what vaccines are doing to us as a society, not as an actual medication or as a therapeutic drug or whatever, but as a symbol of other things going on in American society. Okay? So we'll begin. This conversation actually starts with something that I remember from sort of a 6th grade, 7th grade health book. I remember public schools, at least in North Carolina back in the early 90s, would try to teach you what it means to be healthy and human, right? So this was a graph that I sort of remember from back then. There was like this y-axis of sort of the scale of human health that goes from like 0 to 100. So 100 is like perfect human health, and the maximization of human health, as I've indicated here. And I made this graph. This isn't something I've actually gotten, but it's sort of similar to the ones I remember from the past. On the x-axis, you have this movement from birth until death, right? So as youth in 6th grade in the early 90s, we were taught that we are born, we go from the stage of babyhood or youth or infancy or whatever, and we go into this, or we can sort of pretty much, we're guaranteed that we will live until a ripe old age of 60, 70, 80, somewhere in there. And then there's this notion that life sort of starts as a child, you're fragile, you move into adulthood, and then once adulthood hits, you start to get the aches and the pains and the arthritis and those sorts of things, and then you move down into death eventually. Along the way, there's things that help us out, right? So as babies, we all get vaccines. I remember when I was in 1st grade, I got kicked out of 1st grade for like 5 days because my vaccines weren't up to date. I went to school outside of St. Louis. By the time I moved to North Carolina's public schools didn't care that I had gotten vaccines. They could care less, right? So yeah, vaccines are this interesting thing that plays into public education and sort of the way that you enter into the public school system. Then as you go into adulthood, you're supposed to exercise and eat right, and then suddenly you get into adulthood, and suddenly, you have these vitamin companies and whatnot telling you, well, you're about the age of 30 or 40, you need to start taking tablets for your eyes and those sorts of things, those aches, and take a bit of calcium supplements and those sorts of things to help you out and help you live a better life. Ultimately, you're about 40, 50, 60 maybe. You might break a hip. Your bones become fragile perhaps. You have a sports-related injury. So you have surgery of some sort in there, right? And then you move into vaccines later on in life. So adults are told now, get the shingles vaccine. Because if you had chicken pox back in the day, they're still in your system, get the shingles vaccine now. And then ultimately nursing home. But in my community where I grew up in North Carolina, people don't send their elders to nursing homes. But there's this notion that in America, that's what we do with our older folks. This is the ideal conception of health and wellness and sort of well-being. However, there's a reality. So the curve that goes sort of up and sort of down back here is in actuality this thing that between the phases between sort of birth and becoming an older person, you could easily have disease and death, right? So along the way, child may contract autism. You might have childhood cancer. You might become a teenager. You're diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. You live until 20 to 30s. Anything could happen to your body, literally. So within this context, medical science comes into the picture, right? No longer is it just vaccines and supplements and maybe a needed surgery here or there. Medical science is that promise of life. I know I think it's Abbott Laboratories, if I'm mistaken. Their slogan is a promise for life. So they promise you life, and they're promised to you for life because as a drug company, they're going to make sure that they create medications that help you become treated according to sort of whatever you need treatment for. So whether it's for a man, erectile dysfunction, or for a child, there could be some type of insulin disorder or anything, right? So medical science is promise. So within medical science, we have a lot of things. Not only vaccinations, we have surgeries and drugs and anything medical. Anything, if any of you have read philosophy, Michel Foucault was a French philosopher. He talks about the medicalization of everything. So ultimately, when we, as physicians and healthcare providers, start to open up the body and poke and prod, suddenly the body's exposed in a way, okay? So there's this notion that science, and medical science especially, goes in to try to heal the body, but there is this understanding that perhaps those things are not always good for us. There's books now about back pain. So the back pain industry is big now, and there's a lot of surgeons who sort of lead their patients into, well, maybe we need to do this procedure or that procedure. Well, there's people actually writing, physicians and otherwise, who say, wait a minute. Once you start doing surgery to your back, it's not good. It's not good necessarily, right? So there's multiple voices in that arena. So nevertheless, the curve that you saw back here, which is this upward trend and then lower trend down to ultimately what is death in older age, is actually something that we have to sort of rip apart a bit and say, wait a minute, so death and disease and all sorts of things that can harm our health and our wellness can happen at any time. Well, this presents sort of two scenarios. There are those, and this is indicated by the arrow on the left, there are those who feel that medical science empowers us, okay? So there's those who say medical science is a promise of everything that is good. So you have Atul Gawande, who is a physician who is an advocate for everything about healthcare, and he's an advocate for taking good surgical procedures across into Eastern Africa and into Southern Asia. He's one that says, hey, we should all feel empowered by medicine. Yes, it has its things that are wrong. You know, yes, surgeons aren't trained to be perfect. They have complications, which is the title of one of his books. But we should feel empowered because here in the West, the United States especially, we have medical science that works for us and keeps us healthy. But there are those on the right, as indicated by the arrow going down, who feel vulnerable in the context of medicine and science. Well, who are these people? There are those who say, well, with vaccination, with surgery, with drugs, with anything that is medical, we don't know if the positive outweighs the negative. We don't know if the risks are really that low. The risk may be higher than those in power, government and other power holders, are saying. So keep this in mind. This is our ideal. This is sort of a reality. Now, as you can see on the x-axis, this notion of disease and death is here in the middle of everything else. So we're sort of becoming accustomed to the notion that, and I worked at the Children's Hospital before. When you work in a children's hospital, you're very focused on the idea that there are a lot of children who are at the verge of death, right? They're in the ICUs, they need chemotherapy. But if you work in an adult hospital, you don't really see the child patients. You see adults in ICU, in traumatic car accidents. So death and disease, again, happens along the spectrum between birth and becoming elderly. Anyway, long story short, let's focus on vaccines, though, with all of that in mind. In the past, the United States has been a place of nostalgia over vaccines. So this photo I've seen floating around for years, but essentially, when Dr. Salk sort of perfected and crafted the polio vaccine, literally, healthcare professionals were excited. And this was a picture, and I'm assuming it was sort of framed a bit, but it was a picture taken of a nurse holding up a newspaper saying, "Vaccine triumph ends polio threat." And ultimately, we were told as a public, if you will, through public health announcements. So there were commercials that would say, the polio vaccine has come into America and has saved the day, like our troops are saving the day over in Europe, you know? There was this notion that medical science, and especially these vaccines, were as much a hero as, you know, military troops going overseas and helping democracy and those sorts of things. Nevertheless, if we move forward about 7 years or so, we have the difficult realities of vaccines especially. If you remember, and there's tons of stories, if you remember, there was a case called the Tuskegee experiments where black men in the U.S. South were given different STDs back in the 40s, 50s, into the 60s. Some argue that it was up into the 70s also. But essentially, medical science and public health in the United States, while it was giving polio vaccines to help heal people, eugenics projects sponsored by the federal government were also allowing certain people who were alienated from the rest of society to be treated in a certain way. And this didn't just end there. There are stories, and this is a news article from literally May of last year, so pretty recent. This titled "The Lasting Fallout of Fake Vaccination Programs." Basically, it came out that our Central Intelligence Agency was using vaccine treatments as a front to help capture Osama bin Laden, for example, or to help fight terrorism. So healthcare, literally in the form of vaccination, was used to go out and do other things under the covertness of healthcare and especially vaccination. These are the difficult realities because when ABC News published this, other news media outlets that weren't as famous were like, wait a minute, we've been saying this for like 5 years now, right? But ABC News came out and said it. So it was a pretty big deal. But today's headlines are a bit more sort of non-exciting, if you will. They're a little more undercover or under the radar, but they're interesting. If you can read this, I don't know if you can see, there's several headlines here, and this was from like 2 days ago. I did a copy screen. The top one says, a University of British Columbia neuroscientist has, quote unquote, academic freedom to look for links between vaccines and autism. The second link says, most pediatricians delay vaccines if asked by parents, which is a big deal because a lot of people who are very pro-vaccine, and I'll use that term at this point in my talk, a lot of people who are pro-vaccine say people shouldn't ask a physician to delay or spread apart vaccines because we've been putting vaccinations together in a certain regimen for 20 or 30 years, and people don't know why they're asking for the vaccines to be separated. Anyway, that's a very big deal today. The third headline says, doctors knowingly violate the AMA's code of medical ethics with vaccines. Now, this is from a news source called Natural News. So this Natural News is basically a media outlet that sort of bucks the medical system, if you will. And they're actually making claims that the AMA, the American Medical Association, is allowing physicians to give vaccines with knowledge, perhaps, that these vaccines are doing certain harm. And on from here, the next headline down is health officials perplexed by vaccination skeptics. So there's a return conversation. People are saying, wait a minute, who are these people who are skeptical and who are telling us that the AMA is unethical? And, you know, who are these scientists who are really seeking out this connection between autism and the MMR vaccine, for example? Why are they doing that? That's crazy. And then the last one is a headline that is a little bit off topic, but it's about $3.7 million worth of vaccines that were lost or disposed of in Pakistan recently. So that's today's headlines. Now, if we can get into sort of what these different voices are, we have to begin talking about information, as I call it, information against the odds. So we have information that comes from official sources. So there are pediatricians that belong to pediatric organizations that are nationwide that have certain ways that they look at how their children and their clinics are treated. But you have information, and especially in the form of news outlets, that actually come back and say, hey, why aren't people skeptical of vaccines? So I want to play this short video just so you can hear these voices, okay?
Over 500 Pakistani parents arrested for children's failure to get polio vaccine. Now, this is what we talk about when we talk about vaccine freedom. And I've spoken about this many times. I cannot give a realistic estimate of how many vaccine stories we've done in just the past month alone. But when you talk about vaccines, I have no issue with the vaccine itself. I have no issue with taking medication itself. But if you go get the influenza vaccine insert that you get at any Walgreens or CVS pharmacy, it says on the insert that it can give you diarrhea, nausea, or vomiting, among many other symptoms. It seems like to me the side effects are just as bad, if not worse, of catching the flu. And then also we did one about the hepatitis A vaccine, where it says your kid has pretty much a 10% chance of getting a fever up to 100 degrees or 104 degrees. And you say, well, it's only 10% chance and it's, 104 degree fever. But keep in mind, these are very young children, among many other side effects, many other vaccines out there. So if you do decide to get these vaccines, I think you, the parent, have the right to know about this, because you'll watch the late night shows. Just last night or recently, Jimmy Kimmel was on TV talking fun about this. Also Conan O'Brien. And I like these late night guys, but they're out there making jokes and not presenting any real actual facts. In fact, like when the World Health Organization went to Syria and they started giving vaccines to the children, the smallest estimate I've seen a pretty big number, but the smallest estimate was 15 of those kids died from the vaccines, and they admit it was the vaccines. Now, it was various theories and reasons why they thought this happened, but they do admit that the kids died from the vaccines. You guys can go look that up for yourselves. And the point I'm trying to make is, even if this was a bad batch or one-off deal, vaccines are not immune to human error. Because you see on the TV all the time, you're watching TV and it says, hey, if you took drug X between this date and that date, call to be part of our class action lawsuit, which tells you right there that yes, medications can be harmful, they can have bad mixtures, but the difference is if you're taking a pill, you can just stop taking the pill. If you have a vaccine, you can't go in, pull that out of yourself. So you need to take these things into account before you go and take these harmful substances or potentially harmful substances. And with more of that, we'll go to break with this special report from Radu. We'll come back right after this break with more.
Okay, and if you want to watch more of that, you can. The point is, you can hear in his conversation that there's this trust of the science behind vaccines. But everything that is very culturally and environmentally present around the science of vaccines is troubling for this individual on, I think it's called InfoWars, and for other people in alternative media or people who want to provide an alternative view of medicine and healthcare. Okay? So moving forward, how does healthcare listen and respond? That's one of my major questions to this community. How does healthcare listen and respond? I think my argument is I think professional boundaries are being redrawn as we speak right now. I think, especially in pediatrics, but especially along the spectrum of healthcare, from pharmacy to medicine to for those who are becoming physician assistants and are really reaching into these alienated communities because of a lack of medical doctors today, they're seeing a lot of people who are coming out of, I'll say the woodwork, but I hate to use that term, out of the shadow, if you will, and are saying, wait a minute, I don't trust this. And they're having to sort of interact with those patients to say, wait a minute, I don't want to argue with you. I don't have time to argue with you. But my question is, what happens with that conversation? The person approaches the healthcare provider and says, I don't trust healthcare and medicine in this way. The healthcare provider hears that, but how do they respond? Now, I find it interesting that in social media, there's sort of a counter narrative or a counter platform for these alternative messages. This is a meme that's been circulating around Facebook. It's a pediatrician, Mike Ginsburg. And I'll read this because I think his message is very pertinent to sort of how we understand the power dynamics in this conversation. He says, in my practice, you will vaccinate and you will vaccinate on time. You will not get your own spaced out schedule that increases your child's risk of illness or adverse event. I will not have measles shedding children sitting in my waiting room. I will answer all your questions about vaccine and present you with facts. But if you will not vaccinate, then you will leave my practice. And I'm thinking Hippocratic Oath right now. This is an interesting conversation. I will file a CPS report, Child Protective Services probably, not that they will do anything for medical neglect too. I have patients who are premature infants with weak lungs and hearts. I have kids with complex congenital heart disease. I have kids who are on chemotherapy for acute lymphoblastic leukemia who cannot get all their vaccines. In short, I have patients who have true special needs and true health issues. Now, notice his use of the word true here. Who could suffer severe injury or death because of your magical belief that your kid is somehow more special than other children and that what's good for other children is not good for yours. So this combo is chock full of stuff, right? This pediatrician, as he ends it, this pediatrician is not putting up with it, never have, never will. So I think this is interesting because as much as there's this alternative media and alternative sort of outlook at sort of what vaccines and other healthcare regimes do to society, you have healthcare from within. You have people within healthcare saying, wait a minute, I have to set boundaries. I have to say where my line is drawn in the sand. And for me, this is not just a social conversation. This is a philosophical and maybe an ethical conversation. Because if you're taking the Hippocratic Oath or some similar oath, how does that affect you in this particular conversation? So, I think there are several critical areas of contestation between these people who are over here questioning or are anti-something and the people within healthcare and within science who say, you need to do this because there are facts and there's evidence and you don't have it. I think there is a contestation between the notion of biomedicine as savior and enemy. Okay? The folks that are very pro-science, and I'll use that term right now, pro-science and pro-vaccine and pro pretty much everything related to medical science and medical science facts, those people say, medical science is our savior of the day. A lot of us are non-religious. We don't believe in things that are, and the pediatrician uses the term magical. We don't believe in those things. We believe in medical science and medical fact. However, on the other side, though, there is a large population of people which they often come into contention with that see medical science and science probably in general as some form of enemy. Now, this has a long, deep, complex history back into debates between anthropologists and Christians back in the early 20th century. Anthropologists and Christians debated one another, took each other to court. They totally drug each other to the mud because anthropologists want to say Christians are stupid and magical. Christians want to say anthropologists don't care and they don't believe in God and they're going to go to hell and all those sorts of things. So there was that dichotomy that exists in the early 20th century, which now has sort of resurfaced almost in the form of this vaccination debate and more generally a debate between people who sort of question or are sort of vulnerable within the context of medical science and those who truly trust and believe that medical science is the way to go. So beyond that sort of dichotomy, there's a dichotomy between quantitative versus qualitative. And I actually describe this in a very brief conversation. Person one says, you haven't given me data, so I shouldn't believe that vaccines or anything else that is in medical science hurts you. Person number two says, well, you haven't listened to my experiences. Okay? And I think that's very, very important. There is this contention within the very nature of personal conversations where one person could say, I believe in data, I believe in hardcore facts, I believe in non-magic. And the other person that says, I'm not about magic, but I am about protecting myself and protecting my humanity within my role as a human medical subject. So the third area beyond that, though, is we know that we need to build discernment into medical science and healthcare. The MCAT is actually moving towards more social science. The people in charge of admissions in the national medical community are saying, wait a minute, students entering medical school need to have a consciousness beyond the biochemistry and the anatomy and those sorts of things. So, and we actually had a non-conference here with the medical school this past weekend, and some of us were actually talking about social medicine and medical humanities and other things that nationwide are becoming more and more implemented in medical schools because the accreditation boards are saying, hey, I know your students are smart and they can pass the step 1s and the step 2s, but what truly makes them human and what allows them to connect in a humanistic way to their patients and people they're treating? From here, we move into, I think, what is the most important dichotomy, which is between vulnerability and power, or between the vulnerable and the powerful. So very quickly, who are the vulnerable? And this is a long conversation, a conversation of its own, but I think there are several major groups within this vulnerable category. There's the traumatized communities. So you have African American, Native American people, and I had one of my friends who's a cardiologist who also got on Facebook and told our community back at home, which we're Lumbee Indian, my wife and I, he basically blasted them. You all need to go and get your vaccines. Quit questioning the doctor. Quit acting like your children are better than everybody else. I mean, he was just blasting people on Facebook. And I was like, and I asked him in private, I said, listen, these people that you're attacking, their mothers and grandmothers were almost euthanized or almost sterilized by eugenics projects in North Carolina and neighboring states. So for you to tell the children and grandchildren of those people that they should just automatically trust the physicians in the healthcare system is really weird because you're only 1 or 2 generations from eugenics. So you have those traumatized communities. And then you have the anti-GMO and the anti-big-pharma communities. Now, what happens is these communities are not really the racially and economically disenfranchised. They tend to be white and wealthy. So the people at Disney World who took their children to Disney World and their children had measles, and a lot of them tended to be fairly wealthy. They're talking about measles outbreaks in the suburbs of Chicago. These aren't poor colored kids. Some of these are wealthy kids. Some of these kids are homeschooled, right? They have resources. So the dynamics of the racial and sort of economic and social dynamics are really skewed in terms of who are the vulnerable in this case. So beyond the traumatized, beyond this sort of anti-GMO, anti-big pharma, you have those who are bearers of anecdote. So you have those who have people saying, or who hear people in an official capacity say, oh, there's no data for the connection between autism and your child's MMR shot. However, they've witnessed literally their child, maybe somebody else in their family who upon vaccination have had reactions. Okay, I talked to people here in this university and outside the university who said that it's not just autism. There are diseases where once you get a vaccination and your body reacts to it in terms of your body's immunity, you can't get any more vaccinations. So one vaccination pretty much ends all your ability to get further vaccinations. So again, the traumatized is sort of anti-GMO and anti-big pharma. Those people who don't trust the government or pharmaceutical companies who create vaccines. And then this third category are the people who have personal stories, who don't know really how to articulate what they mean, but they know that because of those personal stories and those things close to them, they don't trust vaccinations and other components of healthcare medicine. So anyway, moving forward, who are the powerful? If these are the vulnerable, who are the powerful? We have these terms, and I've used them already, the corporate entities, including big pharma. The U.S. government. So you have the U.S. government who's been exposed in terms of the CIA of going to a different country and using vaccines to do something else, right? And we have this history also of the U.S. government and other powerful entities who have used vaccines and similar sort of treatments to hurt people. So that image of the government and sort of big pharma now growing as a corporate important corporate entity, those entities are big clouds hanging over us. Excuse me. But then you have medical professionals and sort of the sense of public health below that. I use this meme, which was also on Facebook. There's tons of memes. This is Dr. House, right? Anybody not seen House before? Anybody? Okay. So Dr. House is used in his kind of scowling face, saying, to a mother of unvaccinated baby who doesn't trust pharmaceutical companies. You know another real good business? Teeny tiny baby coffins. You can get them frog green, fire engine red. Really. The antibodies and yummy mummy only protect the kid for 6 months, which is why these companies think they can gouge you. They think that you'll spend whatever you ask to keep your kid alive. Want to change things? Prove them wrong. Few hundred parents like you decide they'd rather let their kid die than cough up $40 for a vaccination. Believe me, prices will drop really fast. So again, I think this is interesting because it's taking the kind of persona of big pharma and government and saying, wait a minute, you don't have time, whoever you are, don't have time to not trust them. They, incidentally, create vaccines that your child needs. Do you want your child to live a long life? We're going to take the vaccine. Really doesn't leave a lot of room for conversation. It's very powerful. It's very kind of directive. It's very overwhelming at times to hear messages like this. But then, and this is why I sort of separate these two, the corporate entities and government and medical professionals. Medical professionals at this very moment are really caught in the middle. They do hold power, but they also hold power in terms of they hold power because they have these degrees and sort of credentials to treat people. But they also have the power to shift conversations, to change the nuances of how people argue over these things. So I think the medical professionals, yes, while they are powerful, they're also becoming very vulnerable also. And then you have public health. I make an argument that we really don't have public health anymore. And I'll explain that in the next slide. So I think there are changing senses of public life. I think public health has been reduced. As an anthropologist, I've done research in North Carolina with missionaries and Native American communities and in various contexts in healthcare. I've worked in pharmacy over 10 years as a pharmacy technician. Public health really doesn't exist like we want to imagine it did 40, 50 years ago. And I think it parallels other missing publics. There are very few public schools anymore. When I moved to Chicago, I thought I would be surprised at sort of how things are different here, but as I moved to Chicago over that 1 or 2 years, I realized, wait a minute, back in North Carolina, a lot of the people in my community are sending their kids to private schools. They're taking them out of the public school system. Well, what does this do? The private schools and sort of these homeschool scenarios don't have rules for vaccinating your kids. So whereas I was kicked out of first grade or kindergarten, whatever grade it was, for about 10 days for not getting my vaccines up to date, the same rules don't apply in these private sort of non-public sectors of society. And then there's more than that, there's power that is often placed in the domestic space. So I have an aunt who listens to Dr. Oz like Dr. Oz is God himself. What do the physicians say? I don't really trust the physician. I don't trust my healthcare provider. But Dr. Oz was talking about this colon cleanse and about this and that and that. And I'm like, wow, what is this relationship between Dr. Oz and the people who are listening to you, checking your heartbeat, feeling your skin, smelling things around you, using all the senses around your healthcare subject and being. But Dr. Oz, who is a celebrity who is way off from your reality, is suddenly giving you information that appeals to you. So there's a sense of distinction between the celebrity of a Dr. Oz or some other celebrity person, and then this notion that people back at home are beginning to say, wait a minute, I don't need healthcare providers close to me telling me what to do because I already have the information. So there's this domestic sort of consumer empowerment going on. So more than that, though, and lastly, I think, yes, there's a healthcare identity crisis. And I want you all to see this. I don't know do we have any pharmacy people in here? Okay, I want you all to pay attention to this, and perhaps, if we have a couple minutes, tell me what's going on.
Yeah.
So this guy, and I'll explain it quickly, Engineer Truth does these YouTube videos of different careers. So in this case, he has a younger pharmacist who's worked for CVS and some pharmacy chain on the West Coast, who's describing, hey, this is what my life is like as a pharmacist, and here's the realities, and here's sort of the imaginary things that I sort of envisioned before I entered pharmacy. Anyway, this is further along in the conversation, but I want you to hear what he says in terms of what he does in his work.
Hospital pharmacy.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but I think she makes it's a lot more boring.
Yeah.
She does. Because at least with you get the human interaction to talk to people, and you do get a distant light consultation.
Yeah.
For her, she does auditing. So basically, she just goes through records and makes sure there's no prescriptions that interfere with each other. It's pretty dry.
It's pretty dry, and that's the thing. I think retail pharmacy is great for like a natural extrovert like me. You know, I couldn't imagine being stuck in that hospital just auditing people all the time. You know, there's not enough interaction for me.
Yeah. All right. Next card.
All right. All you do is count pills and get paid for it.
So is that your expectation that you had for pharmacy?
Yeah, because my stupid friend told me that when I was in high school, and I was like, oh crap, you get paid 6 figs, you get your doctorate, and all you do is count pills? Deal, dude. That sounds like a promising thing. But as a pharmacist, you actually have a lot of responsibility. I'm not only counting pills, I do count pills, but I'm also in charge for managing my pharmacy. I have staff, I have technicians. I need to make sure that they're doing the stuff that I need to. I have corporate responsibility. I have legal responsibility too. So let's say if controlled medication like Vicodin or something goes missing, I'm the one that has to fill out that paperwork and do all that documentation. You know, I have to call doctors' offices, insurance companies. So it's a lot on the plate, you know.
What's the biggest fire that you had to clean up?
The biggest fire I ever had was actually somebody seizing in my pharmacy. They were having an active seizure in my pharmacy.
A patient or your coworker?
A patient, yeah. Yeah, they're seizing in my pharmacy, and like, it's pretty funny how people are. Obviously, I'm going to tend to the person that's seizing in my pharmacy, but people like were complaining like, "Where's my cream?" This and that. I'm like, dude, look over here. This person's like down on the ground.
Wait, while the person's having a seizure?
Yeah.
Customers are complaining that they're not getting their medication?
Yeah. People are complaining and stuff like that. It's pretty crazy, but you know, you just have to. It's pretty ridiculous, right? It sounds
how
really
big of a
ridiculous.
dick can you be? Like, hello, I can't wait 10 minutes. I gotta go. Like the guy's like.
Dude, and that person was like complaining about a cream too, and I was like, oh my god, dude, I have this patient seizure, I have to deal with this stuff. But I mean, it's kind of like resetting expectations as a pharmacist. All that is happening, and you gotta tell your patients like what's going on, because they might not see that patient seizing, and it's kind of like resetting their expectations as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Alright, next.
Alright. I hear this a lot, or what is it? You start with high pay, and then you cap out.
So you don't cap out?
I guess like for an average performer, if you're just gonna clock in, clock out, yeah, that's true. Of course, why would they ever want to pay you a higher salary or a higher hourly rate, wage, right?
Yeah.
If you're gonna be a top performer and you can add value to the company, this year alone, I made at least probably like 50,000 for flu shots alone, you know, and that's just me, you know? So, I mean, I obviously get compensated appropriately if I'm bringing that.
Is that an upsell? Is that an upsell?
Yeah, it's an upsell. So whenever you drop off a prescription, they ask you. Whenever you pick up your prescription, they ask you.
Does that mean you sold 50,000 worth of flu shots? Does that mean you sold 1,000 flu shots?
Basically, yeah, this year, yeah.
Dude, that's a lot of flu shots.
Yeah,
so that means they average it 3 a day.
No, I give a lot more because you have to realize flu shot season, it's only for 3 months or 2 months.
Okay.
So I'm at least pumped.
So you're like 12 or something like that.
12. There's days I pumped out like 20 or 30. I had one of my other pharmacist friends, she printed out a whole list, and it was like, I think she counted 120 in one day. It's like crazy.
For you?
Huh?
Or for her?
For her. Yeah, so I mean, I give a lot, but there's other people giving a lot more as well, you know.
Dang, I had no idea that flu shots they give a small commission for it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's part of your bonus and stuff as well.
Okay, so that's probably one of the more interactive parts of being a pharmacist, and just trying to if you enjoy the sales stuff, which I think you do.
I do enjoy the sales stuff, and it's not like, oh, people think of sales like, oh, you're scammy and stuff like that.
No, people legitimately need flu shots.
Yeah.
Like, I got a flu shot this past season, so.
No, it's funny, I actually don't get immunized, but here's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Those people that want flu shots and stuff, I make it as easy as possible for the most convenient, like as convenient as possible and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't push people to get flu shots. I never do.
Yeah.
I don't think that's ethically right, but if you want one, I'll make it as easy as possible for you.
All right, so we have contending messages there. He knows there's economic force pushing him to do thousands of vaccines per year in like a 2 or 3 months space. But then he says, no, ethically, I don't push vaccines. So I'm wondering if there's some miscommunication there between what he sees as his role as a pharmacist and the messages that are being conveyed to a patient coming in who may have doubts about vaccines. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. So we're left with several major themes here going forward. If you can kind of take all of that info and sort of condense it into several themes. We have cultural relativity. This conversation isn't just about poor black people. It's not just about rich white people. It's not just about people who don't use healthcare. It's not about people who are sort of in healthcare. This is about the conversation about rich, poor, multiracial, across the board. It's not even within the context of the United States. This is a global conversation, obviously. So this really doesn't appeal to certain populations in any way. This is about sort of everybody and sort of how our communities are being redefined. This is also about professional relativity. Who's responsible? Is this pharmacist responsible for pushing this public health initiative of flu vaccines on a patient? Apparently so. Do the people who interact with the CVS pharmacist see a public health professional or public health activist? Probably not. Again, the spectrum of sort of who's responsible and how they engage people who they're responsible to is changing rapidly. Then you have conspiracy theory. We watched a video earlier from InfoWars. Those people there at InfoWars are considered conspiracy theorists. But what they end up doing oftentimes when they're combating sort of this kind of pro-science, pro-vaccination sort of rhetoric is they say, wait a minute, we have facts that counteract other facts. So again, in this notion of conspiracy theory, you have to ask who controls senses of truth. So then there's communication. Communication is different now. People are fighting on the internet. Polite people in the room may not buck each other. They may not say, hey, are you vaccinated? I don't want to be around you. But on the internet, on the social media, game's on. These two pharmacists, you could actually go on YouTube and chat with them right now. Their names are on there. They chat with people that respond to the video. If you would say, hey, I don't like what you're saying about pushing vaccines, they'd probably have a response because people have probably already asked them. So again, social media and then sort of how it sort of exists relative to sort of the rest of the world is interesting. Public health. I make an argument that there is no public health. I mean, and it's a longer argument, another lecture, but it's a lack of public health in a very, very private world. Privatization of everything. Your domestic space, pharmaceutical companies who have to make a profit for their shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. And are we okay with what we discover? So our motto here at Rosalind Franklin is life and discovery. But ultimately, when that discovery goes out and takes on the form of something that is sold to somebody or given in terms of public health to somebody or produced for somebody so that they can become a certain sense of healthy and well, if you will, are we okay with all of that discovery? How do we control it? How do we relate to it? You know, once we make these scientific discoveries, once we become healthcare providers, ultimately, do we feel that we can sort of put out the fires that start when people start questioning vaccines and questioning medical science and those sorts of things? They're lingering questions. Anyway, I'm going to end there because we don't have much time. If anybody has any questions, I guess we can talk for a bit. I'm open. If there's something that I was unclear about, perhaps. But thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, so I have a question. You know, I think it's I mean, thank you for putting out some of the different perspectives that people have that bring them to the various conclusions. I guess I'm wondering about practical implications for communicating and I guess getting at communicating and persuading, in fact. Do you think that some of the different vantage points that people that lead people to not vaccinate give us an insight on how best to approach them as healthcare professionals?
I think, and I'm glad you asked that, the communication, I think, is a very big deal. It might be the most important of these themes. Ironically, we just had this big to-do with the net neutrality vote in Congress, I believe. As much as we're in this vaccination debate, we're in the middle of how we are allowed to communicate. Google has been accused of eventually condensing its information that it conveys to a person doing a search engine search, facts into this two categories. One that is facts and one that is sort of alternative opinionated information. right? Now when you do Google search, it's everything in between. That you can get, if you did a search of vaccine, you would get a website for the CDC, then you get this message on a blog from this person who hates conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers, and then you get some mom talking about autism on her personal website, and so on and so forth. For us to learn how to communicate perhaps better, and to sort of, as healthcare professionals, go in and interact with people, it's part of what is already going on at this university, I believe. Whether it's in terms of what you all have been introducing, which is the medical humanities, or in terms of what we already have been doing in interprofessionalism, learning to understand that we, even as professional healers, as professional scientists, come to the table with a lack of knowledge of a lot of things. And I think there needs to be humility within the healthcare field in a lot of ways, because, I mean, I've worked around angry nurses and angry doctors and angry pharmacists for over a decade. Everybody's angry because nobody respects them. And I've always asked the question, why don't they respect you? And ultimately, it's not about the science or the healthcare. It's about the fact that people are here with these certain credentials and this certain expertise and in this position of power in a hospital, public health clinic, or whatever. And these people are over here who say, what power do I have? I ultimately have the power to choose whether I want healthcare or not. Which makes it interesting because, again, those who are conspiracy theorists, if we want to use that term, say, well, we're starting to see more and more states, such as Texas, for example, who are voting to have immunizations mandated, unlike ever before. If you don't get vaccinations, you will have these penalties of law, whether it's being thrown in jail or something like that. So it's very interesting. This isn't just about communication in healthcare, and it can't be. This is about how our larger community is changing and how healthcare fits into that. Whether it's net neutrality, whether it's the laws around, treating your children. I mean, the pediatrician on Facebook says, I will call Child Protective Services even though it won't matter. Really? Is that part of your Hippocratic oath? I don't know. I mean, there are things that are serious, but is this one of those serious things? And that's sort of the question we have to ask. And I guess to my point, we have to be willing to have a conversation. These conversations, I don't think, ultimately begin in healthcare and medicine until we take, for example, interprofessionalism and put a little meat on the bones, if you will, and state, well, why is it the Native American people down in southeastern North Carolina, where I'm from, don't trust healthcare? Well, it's different than why immigrants in New York City don't trust healthcare and why African Americans in North Chicago don't trust healthcare. There's different reasons. But we have to identify and sort of appreciate all of those differences before healthcare providers ultimately will be more respected within their positions of power. I hope that helps answer the question. Because as an anthropologist, I can't just take healthcare and say, well, what practically can we do? Well, as healthcare providers, we have to sort of be cognizant of everything that's going on. How all the media and means of communication are changing. So, I want to ask the pharmacy person, what do you think about the last video? Did it startle you, perhaps? Maybe. I don't know. Did you react to it internally?
I don't really feel like I agree with everything that he said. I think everyone has their opinion.
Right.
David, I want to thank you for presenting this afternoon, and I want to thank you all for being part of the conversation with us. And I assume you would be happy to talk with me.
Absolutely. I'll be around for a few minutes. I know you have to go, so but I'll be around for a few minutes if you want to chat. Yeah. But thank you very much.
Thank you.